Those of you who frequent Center on Global Energy Policy events know we start promptly on time and end promptly on time. And we have a pretty extraordinary group of participants today, so I want to be respectful of their calendars and leave enough time to really have a good conversation about this important topic and open it up for conversation. So let me just quickly tell you who's here. Very briefly, I'm not going to read full bios because that'll take half the session. But my name is Jason Bordoff. I'm a professor at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, director of the Center on Global Energy Policy there. And given what's happening in the world today, in addition to our long-term research projects, we think it's important to make sure that we're convening people to help the public understand things that are happening in geopolitics and in the energy markets today. And what's happening in Iraq is very important and consequential and fast-moving, both for national security, geopolitics, and also for energy markets. And so we want to spend an hour and a half talking about it today. We have a great group of people to do it. I'll introduce them starting at the far right. Daniel Sternoff is not Michael Knights, but Michael Knights, unfortunately, wasn't able to join us, and I really appreciate Daniel stepping in on short notice, who's been writing what's happening in Iraq and really with a lot of important details over the last couple of days. He's Senior Managing Director at Medley Global Advisors, joined the firm in 2002, and his research focuses on oil markets, on geopolitics, and he has a background covering Middle East politics for Reuters for many years before joining Medley, and so has particular expertise in the region we're talking about today. Ed Morse, who's next to him, many of you know, is Managing Director and Global Head of Commodities Research at Citi. Before that, he held similar positions at Credit Suisse, LCM Commodities, Lehman Brothers. He is on the advisory boards of lots of centers, most importantly, the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, and has held senior positions in government and really falls at that intersection of a deep market expertise, but also helping to inform the public dialogue over this by frequently publishing in Foreign Affairs and other publications like that. Next to him is Meghan O'Sullivan, who's the Jeane Kirkpatrick Professor of the Practice of International Affairs and Director of the Geopolitics of Energy program at Harvard's Kennedy School. Between 2004 and 2007, she was Special Assistant to President George W. Bush and Deputy National Security Advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan during the last 2 years of her tenure in the White House. She spent 2 years in Iraq, most recently in the fall of 2008, to help conclude the security agreement and strategic framework between the United States and Iraq. So there's few people better to join us today to help us understand what's happening in Iraq than Meghan. Heilma Croft is Managing Director and Head of North American Commodities Research at Barclays. She's also responsible for the firm's research covering the economics and politics of the key commodity-producing countries in Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, was with the Business Intelligence Group at Lehman Brothers before that, and prior to joining Lehman was the Intelligence Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and spent 4 years as a Senior Economic Analyst in Asia-Pacific, Latin America, and Africa offices of the Central Intelligence Agency. And then finally, my colleague at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, Austin Long, who serves on the faculty there. He formerly was an associate political scientist for RAND, serving in Iraq as an analyst and an advisor to the multinational force Iraq and the U.S. military. Worked as a consultant to the MIT Lincoln Laboratory on technology and urban operations in counterinsurgency, and was co-founder of the Working Group on Insurgency and Irregular Warfare at the MIT Center for International Studies, and is a participant in the RAND Counterinsurgency Board of Experts. So we're just going to jump right into it, given the extraordinary expertise that we have here. I'm just going to sort of, I think, rather than letting everyone just give opening statements, if people have opening statements they want to make or thoughts they want to give, start with that. What I thought we'd do is spend the first little bit of time sort of talking about what's actually happening on the ground in Iraq right now, what we know, what we don't, what the implications might be, what the potential responses and actions from the U.S. might be, and then sort of transition to really talk about what it is meaning and could mean for energy markets. But let's start by making sure we kind of all know what's actually happening on the ground today in Iraq, where things stand, what areas have been affected, if that could spread to Baghdad or further south. And Meghan, maybe I could start with you to just tell everyone what's going on right now.
Sure. Thanks, Jason, and thanks for inviting me to be here with you and your center. I won't spend too much time on this because I think if you're plugged into the media, you probably have a good sense of what's happening. Essentially, what the Iraqis are facing right now and what the U.S. and the regional players are facing with is, I guess I'd like to describe it in the most easy way possible, as saying that the border between Syria and Iraq has just been expanded eastward significantly into Iraq. And we have a situation now where ISIS or ISIL, depending on which nomenclature you want to use, has effectively gained control of huge swaths of Iraq, mostly the predominantly Sunni areas inside of Iraq. And the question is now, will they actually expand this military front further south and into Baghdad? And that, it seems that in the last day or so that the Iraqi forces have been able to hold them off a bit, although they've made some strategic advances in the areas around Baji, which is where the largest refinery is in the country, and other places. I think this is kind of the first wave of this crisis, which is not it's surprising in one way and not surprising in the other way. The way in which it's not surprising is that ISIS had been making advances into Iraq and pretty far into the territory of Iraq for the last 6 to 8 months. So if you've been following this closely, you've seen this steady advance. You may remember stories of just a few weeks ago of Samarra, which is a city not too far north of Baghdad, which came under a pretty serious attack from ISIS. So that, in some ways, has been anticipatable. One of the things that was most surprising was how quickly the Iraqi forces stationed in those areas that ISIS has taken over with has collapsed. And the numbers that I have heard is out of about 250 Iraqi battalions, about 70 are unaccounted for. That's a very substantial amount. And when we look at why that might be the case, I think one of the real causes of this quick collapse of the force is the politicization of the military, of the Iraqi military, that has happened since the end of December 2011, when American forces left Iraq and Prime Minister Maliki began a systematic effort really to replace independent and professional commanders, many of them Sunni in the army, with more Shia partisan figures. But we can talk about the core reasons for all of this, but as I said, I think this is kind of the first wave of the crisis. I think there will be other waves of the crisis. Again, won't go into many details unless people would like. I don't think that there are any serious prospects of ISIS taking over Baghdad. Baghdad is a very different city than Mosul, which is the second largest city in Iraq, which ISIS has taken control of. It's a much larger city. It's a much more mixed city. You have security forces protecting it, which are loyal to the prime minister and have demonstrated an ability to kind of hold the line there. However, I think what the second phase of this crisis could unfortunately look like is widespread sectarian violence. You may have heard about the Ayatollah Sistani, the most significant Shia religious figure in Iraq, and some would say in Shia Islam, called on able-bodied men to pick up their weapons and fight to defend the state. He was talking about doing that in the context of supporting the Iraqi security forces, but of course, the Iraqi security forces can't actually accommodate an influx of tens of thousands of young men in the same afternoon. So you have a lot of armed men mobilized under religious fervor, moving, towards the front line. So I think that the prospect for widespread sectarian violence is very real. And then you have what could be the third phase of this crisis, which is possible fragmentation of Iraq, because an important, the last baseline that I'll lay out is that the Kurds have moved in and taken control of areas that have been considered contested for the last many decades, depending on who you speak with. So they've taken control of Kirkuk and the surrounding areas, and that's, I think they'll be very reluctant to give up that territory now that they have it. And depending on what actually happens in Baghdad, this could be the Kurds' moment to actually make a play for, if not confederation of Iraq, then perhaps independence. So I think we're kind of moving out of this first phase, which is ISIS-focused. From the U.S. perspective, it's a very critical phase, and it doesn't end with the start of the second phase, which I think could well be widespread sectarian violence, or the third phase, which could involve fragmentation. How's that for optimism?
Yeah, I was going to say that's quite a picture. Daniel, maybe you can come in, and then I'm going to try to pose specific questions, but if people want to come in on anything, just sort of please signal me. But if you could sort of jump in on that, what your sense of what's happening today, a little bit of background on sort of how this all came about, ISIS, for people, just so everyone has that background, and then in particular some of the comments you heard about what this could mean for the KRG and the North.
Yeah, absolutely. Meghan's exactly right. Those who have been watching this have been seeing ISIS making steady gains, and it's worth just thinking a bit about the roots of this conflict within Syria and what really has enabled the jihadi groups within Syria and ISIS in particular to grow. This may not be an entirely fair comment, but it's not an unfair one, which is, there was a very important moment when President Obama elected not to strike inside of Syria after Assad's use of chemical weapons, and we were very close to doing so, elected not to. And I think a lot of the commentary at that time is that decision was both oxygen for the Assad regime and its backers, as well as for the jihadi groups, where it's very clear that if our policy is Assad must go, but we're doing very little to make that happen, and we support a moderate Sunni opposition, which we're reluctant to actually arm, they effectively were cast aside, and this was the beginnings of what has been steady and very strong gains, and it has been pushing into Iraq. And I think the other thing, maybe just to expand on it, what is worth noting is what has enabled ISIL to gain territories. It's not exclusively ISIL operating in a vacuum. Obviously, the political context was the disenfranchisement of much of the Sunni political elite under Maliki, the way that he had pursued his policies, exclusionary policies towards much of the Sunni political leadership, especially after American forces departed. It, at a minimum, created a vacuum. There very well may be additional groups that have been acting in concert with ISIL ahead of what appears to have been a very well-prepared advance. And something that was pointed out to me to one contact of mine in Baghdad today, which is very interesting, is ISIL, when they first took Mosul, you had seen a declaration over how they intended to be governing the city, which included a whole range of, in essence, Takfiri jihadi declarations that was apparently rescinded yesterday, which may be an indication it's very difficult for them to, the question will be if you're creating a, mini jihadi statelet in Sunnistan in parts of Iraq, can they avoid the mistakes that you saw when the former al-Qaeda in Iraq under Zarqawi controlled it, where they alienated the local Sunni population? It gave rise to the awakening movement that, together with the surge, was ultimately the beginnings of the counterinsurgency to beat that back over time. The political questions, I think, here are how will ISIL control the territories that it is taking, and what will its relationship be with the Sunni population in ways that makes it much more difficult for Maliki, who has burned every bridge that exists towards the Sunnis, to really have a political strategy to retake those areas. And that I know the American policy now is we can come to the assistance as long as Maliki behaves in a more inclusionary way. In other words, as long as Maliki behaves contrary to every way he has behaved until now, and quite likely it's quite unlikely to be able to do that. So that's just a commentary on that situation. I completely agree. I think that the Kurds are big winners here, effectively taking everything they have ever wanted in Iraq, are unlikely to give it back, and we have vastly accelerated a drive towards de facto independence. And it's very interesting to note the lack of engagement between Kurdish forces in the areas they've seized with ISIL forces. And if this may represent a stay off my lawn, don't mess with me, I won't mess with you approach, which is very interesting to watch.
For those, people watching from the outside, sort of the initial sense was Iraqi soldiers in the north, and they kind of threw their hands up and people walked over them. And I was wondering, Austin, you're sort of a military guy. Can you talk a little bit about how you saw that, the perception that the Iraqi security forces performed quite poorly, and what was behind that in your view?
Sure, and I think Meghan's already touched on one of the big ones, which is the politicization and corruption of Iraqi security forces, which predates the end of U.S. involvement in 2011, but certainly accelerated as we withdrew. So, when I was there, particularly in 2009, 2010, talking to a lot of U.S. advisors and to Iraqis as well, They highlighted things like endemic cronyism, that you couldn't get ahead in almost any Iraqi unit without either being affiliated with a political party, paying a bribe, or both. That's obviously no way to run a railroad. So that's a huge part of it. Two sort of more technical features, I think, of the collapse in Mosul were the Iraqis have really poor intelligence. When we were looking at withdrawing, there was a belief that they could make up with human intelligence. In other words, they are gathering intelligence through human sources because they're from the area, they speak the language, et cetera. So they could make up for the loss of U.S. technical intelligence with improved human intelligence. I was skeptical at the time based on things I'd seen in Iraq. And it turns out to be true. And part of that ties back into the political situation. If you're trying to collect human intelligence from Sunnis, you're not doing yourself any favors if you've disenfranchised and alienated the Sunni population to the extent that the Iraqi government has. Bear in mind that we're talking about the Iraqi vice president that's a Sunni, Tariq al-Hashimi, can't even go to his own country now because he's got essentially the death sentence against him. There's a warrant out for his arrest, so he's had to hide either in Kurdistan or in Turkey, right? That's the level of alienation of the Sunni population, so that affects your intelligence. The other piece is logistics. The Iraqis are pretty poor at logistics, and if you can't keep troops supplied, you can't keep vehicles running, et cetera, you're going to have a hard time with military operations. And I think that's important to highlight not only for the collapse in Mosul, but for any prospect of retaking Mosul, right? If you can't supply forces as they advance, it's going to be very hard to advance. So I think that's sort of the confluence of things that led to the collapse in Mosul. You get a surprise attack, which dislocates any force, but is particularly bad when you have this kind of corrupt and politicized force with poor logistics. And so, the final piece, and I think part of why you're seeing stabilization, is not only that ISIL has already overrun most of the Sunni areas and is getting into mixed or Shia-dominated areas, but also Iraqi supply lines are contracting, right? So it's easier to supply when you're closer to your bases. But again, that has implications for their ability to project and retake territory.
So we'll comment a little bit to sort of some of the energy market impacts, as I said, but on this question of what the situation is on the ground, and also kind of, Meghan's alarming scenario for where things might be headed for the region and sectarian violence. I'm just wondering, Ed or Heilma, do you want to come in on any of those things?
No.
Okay, so let's talk about what the U.S. can do at this point. What options exist financially with sanctions, militarily, in terms of what the U.S. policy response we think could be or should be. Meghan, maybe we can start with you again.
Sure, and many of you would have seen that President Obama did a press conference just a couple of hours ago where he announced that he'd be sending, I think it was 300 military advisors to Iraq to advise the Iraqi security forces. And I think this is a positive step. I think it's probably not doesn't constitute the entirety of an American reaction that would be commensurate with our interests that are at stake. But let me just talk for a moment about what I see as kind of one of the fundamental conundrums facing the Obama administration. President Obama a week ago came out and said, I'm willing to entertain military assistance, but only conditional upon political reforms. And as you've heard just from the speakers that we've heard from in the last few minutes, it's very, very clear that this is a sensible approach, that there has to be a change, really a fundamental change in the politics in Iraq in order that any military assistance would be done, to support something that would look like a grounds for stabilizing Iraq over the long term, that this is not just a military crisis, but this is also a political crisis. For those of you who don't follow this on a daily basis, Iraq was in pretty much a full-blown political crisis before this ISIS thing really took center stage. So I think President Obama is right in linking those two things, but I think the real difficulty is putting that linkage into practice, because getting the kinds of political commitments that I think would make this or really any administration comfortable to use military force are just not practical in the time frames that military force is going to be required. I mean, as you've heard today and you've read elsewhere, what the Iraqis are facing right now is an urgent and existential military threat. And they have been offered assistance, may have accepted assistance from the Iranians. I think it's very fair to say they would prefer to have assistance from the United States, but they're not going to turn away Iranian assistance if American assistance isn't forthcoming. And of course, Iranian military assistance will further inflame this conflict. It will reinforce a lot of the fears and perception problems that the Sunnis have about the nature of the state in Iraq. And it will also, give Iran a even more solid toehold inside of Iraq. So President Obama probably needs to make a decision not about incremental support, but he probably needs to make a pretty serious and dramatic decision about just how much military assistance the United States is willing to commit to Iraq. And he'll have to do that before he can see the kind of political reform that he really wants to. It's just, I have been involved in helping Iraqis form a variety of governments and do other political things, and I can tell you these things take a lot of time. It takes a lot of time to form a government. It takes a lot of time to actually renegotiate the political contract, which I think is what the Kurds will want if they want to, if they're willing to stay in Iraq. It won't be under the same terms as the power sharing that has existed even within the current constitution. So this is going to take time. But the Iraqis and President Obama don't really have time for that to unfold before decisions need to be made on military force. So I think that's really the essential conundrum here. And I'm happy to say what my opinion would be, but maybe others want to chime in as well.
Yeah, well, let me turn to you, Daniel. Do you see it the same way?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that it's completely contradictory. I mean, what Maliki is doing in this crisis is mobilizing Shia militias, relying on Iranian assistance, and to the degree within the Iraqi military where units collapsed, I think the response as far as the immediate shakeup you must do within your armed forces to prepare for the battle you're coming would not be unlike some of the things that Bashar al-Assad did with the Syrian armed forces when he was initially faced with problems as the Syrian armed forces started to see defections, and that will be to rely on those you can trust. And every one of those things politically goes against the American conditions for greater support, which is to be more inclusive. And not only that, all of these Shia young militiamen who are answering the call to arms, who are young guys with no training, who suddenly have guns, who clearly can't do anything on the front lines. So they're turning into neighborhood watch in Baghdad and other places. You're already starting to see an increase in things like extrajudicial killings inside of certain neighborhoods in Baghdad, which is only going to further inflame sectarian problems. And if you are a poorer Sunni in Baghdad who doesn't have the means to flee, you may suddenly realize it would be helpful to have some people coming in who can offer some protection. And the people who can offer protection are those who may be sitting in Mosul or Ramadi or Fallujah. So it's very difficult to marry the political conditions that the administration is putting in for support with the political realities on the ground. And the other huge contradiction that we're facing, I mean, this is one conflict. I mean, the Iraq-Syria border doesn't exist in its form. That Sykes-Picot border is not there, and there is de facto a extreme Sunni statelet that emerges. And we're on one side of the conflict, on one side of the border, and thinking about joining it on the other side of the border. And so how do you think, if you do take a step back at what is happening here, we do have independent Kurdistan de facto coming up. We do have rump 9 Shia provinces. Shia-stan is more or less holding with Baghdad with fluid boundaries, and we have this Sunni-stan that's emerging across borders. So how do you think in a holistic way about Syria and Iraq as one unit, not in different lanes, and then really you have to, I mean, it's not only a problem of Iraq. If the core national security interest here is not seeing al-Qaeda-affiliated, ungoverned spaces that can ultimately become a threat to the American homeland. I mean, we use drones in the Afghan-Pakistan frontier. We do this in Yemen. If there's a plane that will fly into the New World Trade Center one day, is it someone who's currently in Mosul right now? How do you approach those questions more urgently? These are things that you can't wait for the Iraqis to get their act together as well.
Meghan's comments about the role role that Iran may play and the potential risks of that? Do you see it similarly?
Yes and no. I mean, it's interesting to know. I was just speaking to someone in Basra today and noting that the Iranians are actually trying to restrain extrajudicial actions by some Shia militias on the ground now. And those who may follow Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's Twitter feed, which I do, there was a tweet this morning in English stating that Takfiris are not the same as Sunnis, meaning the extreme Salafi jihadi version of Sunni Islam that is represented by ISIL is not the same as all Sunnis. So don't be overly sectarian. Now, this may just be propaganda, and while certainly it can be problematic, but it is of note that this seems to be at least what some of the initial actions or messages from the Iranians are in the last couple of days.
So, and Austin, just tactically, in terms of potential response from the U.S., what do you view as the options and what's feasible, or what the implications would be?
Sure. I think the initial commitment that the president announced earlier of primarily special operations forces for advising is a good first step for almost anything, if only because it will allow us to build an intelligence picture. As I mentioned, the Iraqi intelligence picture is pretty poor. Ours has, of course, dropped off massively since we left Iraq as a significant military force in 2011. So as a prerequisite to almost any other intervention, whether it's the use of drones, airstrikes, et cetera, you're going to have to build out the intelligence picture. So this is a good baseline, but the point some of the other speakers have made about the political preconditions, I think, cut against almost any military action. And just to touch on the Iranian point, even if the Iranians are trying to restrain the Shia militias, it inflames Sunni paranoia, right? The Sunnis see Persians behind every bush and every bad thing that happens in Iraq. But there's also a paranoia that's being fed on the other side, which is Maliki and his government see Baathists and or the Gulf states behind every bush and every bad thing that happens in Iraq. And of course, there's already considerable reporting that there is Baathist involvement in this advance, not necessarily as part of ISIS, but in parallel. So that, of course, inflames Maliki's paranoia about the Sunnis, and he's already come out and blamed Saudi Arabia for ISIS. So I think, the prospect for reconciliation was kind of dim to begin with, but then you have this sort of mutually supporting paranoia. So almost anything the U.S. does, if we're going to make it preconditioned on political reconciliation, I think is going to be a non-starter.
So I want to talk a little bit about what's happening. There's obviously security implications for the U.S. In terms of terrorism, and but also energy and commodity market impacts. Iraq is a large producer. When we look out at where the world thinks its oil is coming from for the next decade, Iraq plays a particularly large role. I think the price today is about $115, so it's up about $5 or so. So let's start with that, and then Heilma, tell us how the market has responded, both at the front of the curve and the back of the curve, and how the market is sort of viewing the risks, and is it consistent with what you just heard from the other panelists?
Well, I'm not sure it's going to be consistent with what I heard from the other panelists, but if ever there were a time for an experiment on defining a risk premium, this is certainly it, because we've had a 4 to 5% increase at the front end of the curve, a 3 to 4% increase at the back of the curve, and nothing has changed in terms of the oil market. And indeed, if anything has changed, there may be more oil coming out of Iraq by the end of the year than anybody had predicted at the beginning of the year. So we have this very distinct experiment on how do you define a risk premium, and what is this all about? The front end of the curve is, and the spot market is particularly difficult to figure out in that if you look at other signals in the market, the differentials between different crudes related to Brent, or you look at the sheer availability of supply, this is not what you'd call currently a tight market, although it could be heading to one seasonally in the summer, but that's no different from what it would have been beforehand. I think the back end of the curve movements are a lot easier to explain, and there were, both on the front and the back of the curve, two different movements. So there was the movement around Mosel's taking, and then things kind of moved around not very much. Volatility spiked and then came back to where it was at reasonably low levels before anything happened. And then this week and today in particular, there was some exciting action which seemed timed to, particularly in the back of the curve, timed to the president's statement. The initial push-up in the back, which has been rising a bit for Brent over the past couple of months, was clearly a result of who were buyers and sellers at the back end of the curve. So clearly there were more buyers of call options than there were sellers of call options, and you know who they were. They were consumers, airlines, utilities, refineries, who were taking insurance against what might happen in a more distant period of time. Today's flurry of activity around the time of the president's statement was real fast money hedge fund community. And the interesting thing about that, and I suspect, I'm not in one, so I don't know the reasoning, but I suspect the announcement of 300 military advisors was taken as a deterioration in conditions and military action to come and things unraveling. But then there was a sell-off, so that at the close, the deferred price was lower than it was, as the prompt price was too, lower than it was after before the president's statement. So markets are reacting, but they're not reacting to today's conditions. They're reacting to tomorrow's conditions. And tomorrow's conditions tend to be clearer and clearer. So one of them certainly is that to the degree that the IEA's projections are right, they don't necessarily have to be right. I think the IEA made some alarmingly silly statements. But the IEA has zeroed in on one thing, namely that their projection of supply requirements for the world and OPEC's response would have Iraq supplying 60% of that response between now and the end of this decade. And that clearly is not going to happen on almost any scenario. And I think we know why it's not going to happen. Whether it's full partition or whether there is internal conflict within the southeastern part of Iraq and the Shia community, and I do suspect that the next stage will be internal strife across both the Sunni and the Shia communities, at least as alarmingly as Baghdad against whatever is happening in the Sunni triangle. But just on the face of it, we're not going to see the strategic pipeline patched together anytime soon, maybe ever. The plans for the targeted, modest plans for Iraqi southern oil production, Basra area oil production, is a target of 6.75 million barrels a day, no longer 10.5 million barrels a day, but over 6 million barrels a day. And that target can't be reached. And it can't be reached whether or not companies are still there. And there's another issue about the attractability, the attraction of the investment climate. But they can only build 4 million barrels a day of dock space unless Kuwait wants to lend them some, and that looks pretty unlikely. So they're capped logistically at 4 million barrels a day, not going above it unless there is room to export somewhere else. And that is problematical. The northern part, or KRG part, so Kurdistan Regional Government Area, really is a winner, as everyone has indicated, and oil is clearly at the heart of it. One little problem in that there is no international law governing where the cargoes coming out of the KRG can be lifted, so we have all these cargoes floating around the Mediterranean that nobody wants to buy, even if it's discounted at 50%, because the Baghdad government has put a marker down saying they're going to seize it and go to court on it, and they clearly would win unless something in the international community breaks, and that would either be an agreement between the KRG and Baghdad, or it would be the international community showing recognition of an autonomous KRG and giving legal protection to that set of cargoes. But that issue, which is not minor aside, they do have a lot of cards to play that they didn't have. They do have Kirkuk and the oil fields, and to the degree that Baghdad needs money, they have leverage both over the disposition of their own crude and the disposition of Iraqi crude coming out of Mosul. So, just on the facts to the degree we can really understand them, there are two pipelines in play. There's a pipeline system, which is the ITP, the Iraq-Turkish pipeline, where the strategic pipeline from the south feeds into the north, picks up Kirkuk-fed crude oil when it was working. Now is only Kirkuk-fueled crude oil, going kind of southwest into that pipeline that goes then northwest into Turkey and onto Jeane. That pipeline has not been under KRG control, so they built their own pipeline with Turkish support. That pipeline could have up to 400,000 barrels a day capacity. There's currently like 120,000 flowing into it, mostly feeding Turkish refining requirements, plus these scattered cargoes that are unsold. They could increase their production if they could export crude, and they could ramp it up probably by 100,000 barrels a day by the end of the year if they could freely export. But they still have pipeline capacity for crude, which they could move by truck into their own pipeline system, or they could, with the agreement of whoever is controlling the blocked part of the pipeline, move Kirkuk crude north. And they clearly have a strangle on Kirkuk crude, and to the degree that is leverage for the government, it's pretty significant. So I'd say from an oil market perspective, there is nothing that has happened. The price has gone up at the front and the back of the curve, and the future looks bleaker than it did for Iraq as a whole, and a lot less bleak for the KRG and for the shareholders of companies that have deployed capital there.
A lot to follow up on there, but I want to bring Heilma in and see how you see it.
Yeah, no, I largely agree with Ed. I mean, I think part of the reason we've had a run-up, but not, a major run-up is if you look at the infrastructure, I mean, in terms of energy infrastructure, what's been really targeted is that Kirkuk-Jehan pipeline. That's been, bombed regularly over the last couple of months and essentially been inoperable. Has a capacity of around 600,000 barrels a day. It was doing around 200,000. You've had, some incidents where I think in December 18 gas pipeline workers were killed. But you've had this, in the north. You haven't had anything really major in terms of energy infrastructure in terms of the south. And so I think there is a view in the market that when you look at the distance between Baghdad and Basra, 270 miles, that it's really beyond the geographic reach of these groups. And so there's a sense out there that, the southern energy infrastructure will sort of ride out the storm. Now, I think that what people are potentially watching is any signs that you might see anything down south. Again, certainly the pattern of violence, and the speakers on the stage can talk more about this, has not been really a lot of activity in Basra. But you do see periodic bombings down there. We had a couple bombings in 2013 in Basra proper. And I think one of the problems with Iraq going forward is, the willingness of Western energy companies to stay, put investment dollars in Iraq, given the contract terms in Iraq. And I would say that that's something important to look at, that the type of agreements that the Iraqi government signed with international oil companies in 2010, they were technical service agreements. They pay the companies a per barrel fee to increase production over a certain target. They are not JV agreements. They're not PSC agreements. The companies don't have an equity stake there. Companies have complained that the contract terms are not particularly generous. They've also complained about the real red tape dealing with the Iraqi government, the difficulty getting in your employees, getting in your equipment. They can complain about corruption in and around the Basra area. And so it is seen by international oil companies as a difficult operating environment. And the fact that ExxonMobil, which was in the West Corner 1 project, the fact that I would actually, by some extent, invalidate their contract, that's what the Maliki government would say, by signing a separate agreement with the KRG, I think shows a degree of frustration with Western oil companies operating in southern Iraq. So if you ever did have an incident down there, and again, I'm not saying that that's certainly the likely scenario by any means, but I would argue if you ever had any type of incident down there or a sense that, violence was moving down there, even just on, in one incident, I think that that would potentially accelerate the companies, pulling out employees. particularly Western employees. And we already have reports in the Iraq oil report earlier this week, ExxonMobil, BP, starting to move out some of their Western oil workers. And so the question is, if you got to a situation where they did move out a significant number of Western oil workers, how would production look like if you just had a local force? Now, I think, again, the contract terms are important because I do think companies, for example, if you're operating a place like Libya is a total mess. We've lost around 1.4 million barrels of Libyan production this year. But if you own an equity stake there, you're not really going to pull out. I've heard one chairman of an oil company say, look, we don't get paid much to be in Iraq. We already have localized violence. If you ever got into a situation where there was one truck bomb at our facility, we would leave because we don't get paid to be there. And so, again, I do think that just looking at the terms in Iraq and the contract terms does inform the decisions of companies on how willing they will be to stay there.
Yeah, please.
Just one thing on the violence around Basra. There have been bombings over the past couple of years, but I'm going to put on my Mike Knight's hat since he's not here and talking to him because he's done a lot of work down there. His interpretation of a lot of the violence down there is that it's signaling by Iraqi security forces who want more money. And that it's not a sign that things are going to hell. It's just a sign of corruption in the system. Now, that could be changing, but it's just to point out that when you see violence, it can mean a lot of different things. And I think in the South, it's more demonstrative and, hey, you need to be paying more either licit or illicit revenue. But that could change.
And certainly, I saw the Iraqi foreign minister because there had been a bombing of the major deep water port in Basra, and I asked him specifically about energy infrastructure security in light of what happened at that port. And it was very interesting. His response was, well, it was a criminal gang. It wasn't an extremist group. I mean, it was a criminal gang with a truck bomb that got into the port and did, do some damage to the port. But again, he was differentiating it between extremist groups and, criminal elements. But that said, if you did have any type of incident there, and again, think about the perspective of companies after what happened in Algeria. People always said those facilities were safe. They were in the desert, beyond the reach of these groups, and it was horrific what happened at that facility. I mean, you had dozens of foreign oil workers killed. The ones who lived through it told stories about having C4 put around their necks. So, I mean, again, just with that type of backdrop, it may be a sort of black swan, but again, given the type of terms that you have there, given the difficulty that these companies feel like they have dealing with the central government, I think they would be in a much more cautious mode in terms of taking people out.
If I could just make a few comments on the energy picture, and largely to say that the threats to Iraqi production, I don't think are just in the security realm. So I think when people, not necessarily on this panel, but elsewhere, talk about, well, actually the fields, the overwhelming majority of Iraqi production is in the south, and that's largely Shia. I think it doesn't take into account a wide array of things that will certainly put a curb on production, and Ed mentioned some of them. Heilma mentioned that contract terms make it difficult or less profitable to work there, but it's also just a difficult place to work in terms of getting decisions by the Iraqi government. That Baghdad is a very centralized place, and so decisions always end up going back to Baghdad, and people are constantly, gnashing their teeth over getting simple decisions that they need to continue operating and to continue expansion. And getting those decisions, I tell you, are going to be next to impossible now. The Baghdad government is going to be completely consumed, as one would expect, with self-preservation. And so routine decision-making isn't going to happen. If you look at today was supposed to be a bid round for the Nasiriyah facility. That has been canceled. So in terms of growth, as Ed mentioned, I think we have to really scale back expectations about growth in production, but also just about what can be maintained under these circumstances. Just let me mention two other things quickly, and that is, a potential political threat to Iraqi production in the south has to do with just the potential weakening of Baghdad. I was in Basra, I think, a month ago, and there is a very, very real movement, particularly among Basra politicians, for a federal state in the Basra area. Maybe it's not called a federal state, but one where they have a lot more autonomy, they have a lot more control over oil operations and other things. And when Baghdad, appears to really be losing control over its, reach in the country, this may be an opportunity for people in Basra to really say this is a good time to assert, not to call a separate state, but really to assert ourselves. And then, if you're an international oil company, you have the added problem of not knowing actually who to deal with. Who's the decision maker here? Who's actually controlling the security forces? Is it are they local actors? Are they national actors? It gets very complicated very, very quickly. And this had been the case in Anbar for a while. And the last thing I would just mention, which we haven't talked about, is what I would say, I'm like the messenger of doom, the domestic energy crisis that could befall Baghdad very soon. So I mentioned Baji, which is the largest refinery in Iraq, and that supplies a lot of refined product to about 11 of Iraq's 18 provinces and a lot to Baghdad. And keep in mind, Baghdad's probably about 120 degrees right now. And, an energy crisis, if you've got, I think the Iraqis say they have enough refined product for about a month, but who knows what will happen to that. And so that's, an additional piece of leverage that ISIS and those allied with it have. And so we could see some problems on that front, which will compound.
Turn to Heilma, but just what happens in a month? So they just they need to import fuel from neighboring countries?
I mean, they could in the past. They've ended up importing fuel from Iran and other places. Actually, if I could sneak in one last point is, also and I'm looking a little bit further down the road, but if you assume that the Iranians are actually going to come in, help out the Iraqis militarily, gain more control over southern Iraq, the Iranians don't really have an interest in Iraq outproducing them dramatically. In fact, they have a real interest in Iraq reining in its production for lots of reasons. One, for the price of oil, because the Iranians are really capped at how much oil they can sell right now. And two, this, and Jason can probably talk about this better than I, two, if the oil market gets really tight, it's going to be harder and harder to keep pressure on or to keep the Iranian sanctions intact. And particularly if the talks with the Iranians don't succeed, it seems that the Obama administration's first impulse will naturally be to try to toughen those sanctions. That's going to be much harder to do in a tight oil market. So again, more Iranian influence in the south, I think probably all things being equal, means less Iraqi production.
I wanted to turn to impacts for Iran sanctions. We'll come back to that. But Heilma, you want to?
There's the point that Meghan made in terms of the sort of autonomy movement in Basra. I mean, just one sign of sometimes how frustrating oil companies find it to operate there. I was just at a conference on the Middle East, and one of the big consultants to one of the IOCs who operates down there was saying that, in fact, this company was now hoping that this autonomy movement would succeed down there so you could get better contract terms. And so that, again, just shows the frustration of operating with Baghdad. And I think for a lot of these companies, when they went in 2010, they thought you'd take a bad deal and a better deal will materialize. And that just never proved to be the case.
And guess what? They will get better contract terms because the alternative is not very good. I mean, this is in terms of international repercussions. It's not just that the KRG offers better terms, but it's that Russia offers better terms, that Iran would offer better terms, and that Mexico, the companies, if they weren't thinking of going to Mexico, are absolutely going to go to Mexico. So it's a competitive environment, and to keep companies in the Basra area, terms will change.
Let me just make sure I understood what the view of everyone was on sort of the medium to long-term outlook. There are, as you said, Ed, some big numbers out there for what Iraq could contribute to the global oil market. I think the medium-term oil market report from IEA that came out a day or two ago had 60% of the growth in OPEC production coming from Iraq through 2019. It was about 1.3 million barrels a day. Given both the security situation and all the other factors you mentioned, is that too rosy?
The problem is more general, and it's that we're witnessing the failure of the petrostate. And we've seen it happen really in spades since the early part of 2011. So you start 2011 before the first Libyan disruption with around 500,000 barrels a day, 400,000 barrels a day of oil that could have been on the market, should have been, but was not on the market for some kind of domestic reason in some oil-producing country. And then the Libyan disruption took place. And like most disruptions, this was localized to one country. And oil flows not available rose to around 2 million barrels a day. Now, with the second Libyan disruption, there's roughly 3.5 million barrels a day of oil offline. The remarkable part of that, one of the remarkable features of that is that it's spread among 8 countries. Another remarkable feature is that oil prices haven't budged. Brent has averaged $110 a barrel virtually every quarter, plus or minus 2, every quarter since the first quarter of 2011. But now, with the prospect of disruption coming from one very large, the second largest oil producer in OPEC, and no prospect on the horizon of Libyan oil coming back or any of this other disrupted flows coming back, and the prospect that things could get worse in Nigeria. Maybe they'll get better. Maybe Heilma can bring us hope about her specialty. And Venezuela having kind of serious problems. There really is a limited amount of spare capacity in the world. And the Saudis have used, much of the spare capacity that they have. They claim to have 2.5 million barrels a day of spare capacity. Nobody's ever tested that. So, if you were from Missouri, you'd say, show me and then I'll believe you. But they try to make a coherent argument that they do have it. The other thing that saved the oil market is U.S. production growth. So U.S. production growth has been spectacular. We can't get it out because of oddities in U.S. law, but the growth has been there. The IEA has been a little bit deceiving in balances, by the way. So the IEA's tightish balances already for this year, where they believe the call on OPEC is going to be over 30 million barrels a day, current production under that. They project U.S. production growth for the year at 800,000 barrels a day. U.S. production growth year over year as of this week is 1.35 million barrels a day. They gloss over on the NGL side by projecting U.S. production growth this year at over 200,000 barrels a day. We're kind of 2/3 of the way there, 4 months through the year. So there is production, but the problem really is that the world has no spare capacity, or limited spare capacity, to meet these conditions. So the new reality is a lot of disruption of a lot of oil, and that's kind of the background to thinking about how tight the market can be going forward.
Yeah, Daniel.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, I probably agree with all of these comments about where there could be a near-term impact, even if you don't see any disruption to the current pace of production and exports from southern Iraq, is simply a refiner preference to lighten their reliance on Iraqi barrels. So if you are currently using Basra light for 9% of your feedstock, you might decide, given the uncertainty of what might be coming next, that you want to ratchet that down to 4%. And so it might be a smart thing to go take additional Saudi barrels or start to build additional inventory, which just creates a little incremental source of demand that could even show up by the summer. Just to hold extra inventory makes it more difficult for the Iraqis to market their barrels, and they already have had issues around on quality sometimes. That has been a marketing challenge, and it may mean the Saudis are going to find people deciding they are a stable, reliable supplier with a quick turnaround, and they may find a lot more people knocking on their doors this summer.
Just to add to that, Chinese refiners were going to buy virtually the entire increment of projected Iraqi supply, and they've been the most aggressive in stockpiling, and it's almost certainly the case that Chinese stockpiling this year has been higher than their actual demand growth.
And I think China currently imports half of Iraq's crude.
So Meghan mentioned what impact, if any, this could have on Iranian supply and sanctions and negotiations. I just was wondering if anyone else had any views on that. She had suggested it might make it harder to keep Iranian barrels off the market. Is that, anyone have thoughts on?
And I think it's really an untested issue. We know that there's been damage to Iranian production. There's a lot of gossip, including gossip from people in Iran, on what their real production capacity would be if they could ratchet it back up again. Clearly, tanker tracking indicates that the amount of flows out of Iran since the beginning of the year has been much higher than it was at the end of last year, but it also appears that it's been mostly floating inventory that's been depleted rather than coming out of new production. So we might ironically see even less oil coming out of Iran in the near term. And if there are buyers who want to scurry to get it, it's probably not going to happen overnight because it will take some time to ratchet that production up. The IEA's assumptions and EIA as well, because they've taken that surge in Iranian production out of their oil and disruption numbers because they don't think it's there to come back, and they've taken out 600,000 or 700,000 barrels a day of what was former Iranian capacity, and it would probably be a good 18 months before that capacity came back online.
You mentioned the U.S. boom in supply, but we can't get it out. I've had a couple of reporters ask over the last few days what impact, if any, this situation will have on the crude oil export debate in the U.S. Do you have any thoughts on that? And then Heilma or Meghan or anyone else?
I hesitate to guess because we know that the debate is going to happen and it's been postponed for electoral reasons because internal to both parties there's not a consensus on where that debate should go. And I think the higher that crude oil prices go, the higher gasoline prices will go, and the more difficult it will be to have a rational debate on exports, despite it being more obvious than not that if you export more crude, gasoline prices will go down relative to where they've been. I think we'll see a significant growth in U.S. crude oil exports this year under existing obstacles. And the reason for it is quite simple. U.S. and Canadian crude are bottlenecked, and again, it's going to get significantly debottlenecked over the course of the year because of the build-out of pipeline infrastructure capacity in North America. Just to give a number on it, which is kind of amazing, there's about 3,000 miles of crude oil pipelines being built in the world this year, completed in the world this year, and 2,500 of those are in the United States and Canada. And a lot of that is to bring oil that's currently not waterborne into waterborne areas. We've seen a stunning increase in U.S. exports of oil to Canada, which in the beginning of 2012 was around 20,000 barrels a day. The beginning of 2013, around 60,000 barrels a day. Ended last year at 200,000 barrels a day. The latest data from EIA are 270,000 barrels a day. My earlier projection of U.S. exports to Canada reaching 400,000 a day, I think, is understated by the end of the year. It looks as though there'll be some amount of oil exported to Mexico for a variety of logistical reasons. It looks as though the West Coast is going to get glutted, that Alaskan crude will be exported not to California and Washington, but to the Far East. It looks as though exports of Canadian crude from the U.S. East Coast and the U.S. Gulf Coast are growing at a pace even before pipeline capacity is in place to get that crude in meaningful numbers to the U.S. Gulf Coast, and where there are export capacity constraints. But I'd say a good 200,000 barrels a day plus of Canadian crude will get re-exported out of the U.S. And depending, and here's the one political issue that was raised by John Podesta at your conference, consideration of Eagle Ford crude, which is a code word for condensates, whether there is a decision on that. And I think the tea leaves seem to be reading that there will be. And the Commerce Department has this obscure, otherwise obscure decision-making procedure on exports. That's because they do export controls, and most of these are national security export controls, and there was meant to be no transparency on decisions on export controls. So we have no transparency on decisions on allowances of condensate or any other kind of crude. But it looks as though, since the producers don't want the condensate, it's too much and it's dragging down their production growth. The refiners don't want it because it's screwing up their yields. But there's a good export market for it. And already there's a kind of problem in that a lot of the Canadian crude, maybe some of it that's already been re-exported, has diluent in it. Diluent is condensate. A lot of that diluent comes from the United States. under conditions that allow exports to Canada. It's being re-exported with, maybe people raising their shoulders, but nobody yelling about it. You can export a lot more Canadian crude with a lot more diluent. So you put more condensate in, and currently the West Canadian Select that's being tested in a Spanish refinery looks not as good as Mayan, certainly not as good as Urals, but you can beef up bitumen and you can beef up Mayan and you can make it look a lot more like Urals and make it a lot more attractive. So I would guess that a good 180 to 200,000 barrels a day of condensate will be exported by the end of the year. You add all these things up and you actually get to 1,100,000 barrels a day of potential exports of crude out of the U.S. without changing the law, without changing the system, just under what's allowable. And that could change the debate, too.
Well, this is a topic that we will be talking a lot more about at the center over the course the remainder of the year. But we have 30 minutes left. We're 2/3 of the way through our time. I want to use the final third to open it up to everyone here and take some questions for our panelists. We have microphones that'll go around. We'll start with Pedro Haas here in the front. If you could identify yourself, please keep your question brief.
Hi,
Is it on?
I'm Pedro Haas with HETCO. And I have a question for Meghan and perhaps also Daniel. There was a mention that, she didn't quite put it that way, but it would be preferable to have American military supporting the Iraqi government than to have Iranian military. But I'm trying to understand what the impact of American military shooting Shia, Sunni fighters, even though they may be, of the bad Sunni variety, would have on U.S. relationships with Saudi Arabia, for example, Egypt maybe, other Sunni countries. And it kind of reminds ourselves, that this is an impossible situation. There doesn't seem to be a good answer. Maybe leaving our good old friend Saddam Hussein in place would have not been a bad idea, but he's gone.
Can I respond? Sure, please. Hi, Pedro. It's good to see you. I'm going to leave the Saddam Hussein piece just for the entrance of coherence and me maintaining my temper. And respond to, you've pointed out, a very serious downside to, first of all, you've put out the inherent policy conundrum, right? All the options are bad. That's actually the nature of being a policymaker. So, the challenge for President Obama and his team is not a small one, is to figure out which one has the least bad implications. And that's the case that I was making, which, there is the option of doing nothing. But I think there are more negatives associated with that for U.S. interest than the option of providing military assistance to a government that does have the downside of being likely to be perceived as the U.S. weighing in on the side of Shia in a sectarian situation, and particularly weighing in on the side of Maliki at a time when most regional actors, U.S. actors, and many Iraqi actors think that Maliki is actually part of the problem, as Daniel was talking about, rather than part of the solution. So I think that is something to be acknowledged, and I think it's something to be mitigated, but I do think that's an inherent downside of military assistance. First, I would say, I don't think under any scenario you're going to see U.S. combat troops, shooting at Sunni insurgents. I think those days are well in the past, and that probably wouldn't be a good thing, even if the political climate in the U.S. would maintain that. I think, and Austin could talk about it in greater detail, perhaps, but the range of options we're looking at is largely either potential air power or supporting Iraqi security forces to be more effective. But to your point, I think the question is, okay, how do you mitigate the perception, which is significant and is a danger? And there are a number of ways you could do it. One thing that I'll throw out which I think, of course, would be controversial, but pretty much everything in this basket is that, this might be an opportunity, as Daniel was saying earlier, really, we need to think about this as one theater. Iraq and Syria, a big chunk of Iraq and Syria are now one theater. And so to prescribe a strategy for this half of the theater doesn't really make a whole lot of sense from a strategic point of view. So if you look at the theater that we're talking about, you can do something that might help the Iraqi government that would give you leverage to help push for political change that would make that sustainable over time. And maybe you do something to help the Sunni moderates, which you've been really talking about helping in Syria, but not having done anything very specific there. And so you mentioned Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is actually not a fan of ISIS. And actually most of the region is not a fan of ISIS. I mean, they may take some perverse pleasure in seeing Maliki, get beaten back because they're not fans of Maliki. But this is a strain of Sunni extremism that threatens a lot of the Gulf states as well. I mean, these are people who were rejected by al-Qaeda as being too radical. And so I think that actually Saudi Arabia, but you've got to make that distinction. You have to have a political strategy to try to separate out ISIS from other Sunni groups, and this is a very complicated thing. So I acknowledge that there are downsides, and I don't envy President Obama for having to make these really difficult decisions.
Unless anyone burningly wants to come in on that, there's a lot of questions, so let's go. There's one over here on the aisle, and then back there.
It appears as if since 2011, the prevailing theory has been that Maliki is unwilling to make any compromises, and yet compromise is clearly what's needed. The question, I have two questions really. One is, why hasn't the American government, if they understood this, created more pressure on Maliki to either become more inclusive or replaced him? And the other question then becomes, who are the other alternatives to Maliki? Because there's no use talking about economic issues. I mean, this sounds very much like Vietnam, only Vietnam was more simpler because it didn't have religious overtones and wider political issues that it had. But we're digging ourselves into a grave, and for the president today saying that he's going to send 380 advisors, he's just going down the wrong road. He's got to take a stronger stance in achieving some kind of compromises, or he's going to just fail.
Well, please. Awesome.
Yeah. So, I mean, you have really sort of three options for replacing Maliki. Option number one is they had an election in April. They haven't formed a new government. So you could try and broker a coalition that excludes Maliki. The problem with that is his list, the state of law, won far and away the plurality of seats in Parliament. So it's not mathematically impossible to construct an alternative that doesn't include state of law, but it'd be really tough. Option number two, convince Maliki to step down as head of his own party and replace him with somebody else from state of law or from another coalition partner. If you want to bet on that, I'll take any odds you want. That's not going to happen, right? And option number three, you bring up the specter of Vietnam. It's the ZM solution, right? Use force either through directly or indirectly to remove him. Moral issues aside, that did not work out very well in Vietnam at all, right? We had a cavalcade of worse and worse leaders for a period of years. So I don't think there's really any good prospect for replacing Maliki given the current situation, no matter what any U.S. president wants.
Can I just ask a question to my fellow panelists? I mean, if we go back to the 2010 elections, I mean, Maliki didn't actually win the most seats in that election. Can you walk us through, like, why, you had Al-Alawi's ticket being seen as, unelectable? I mean, why wasn't he actually allowed to form that coalition government? Because there's a view out there that it was Washington and Tehran that were actually kind of on the same page in 2010, was saying Maliki was essential.
Anyone?
I mean, I have my take on it, but I'm sure other people do too.
I'm going to see if I can answer this in a way that doesn't get too technical. But first, if I could just make a comment, and I often end up making a similar comment to Iraqis, is that the U.S. actually doesn't decide who governs Iraq. And it's not really possible for us to remove an Iraqi leader, especially one that does have widespread political support. But as Austin pointed out, if there's any beauty to this moment, it's the fact it comes during a government formation process where already you actually had the Iraqi political elites trying to come together and form a government that would, actually do one of the the first two scenarios that Austin pointed out. And here I would say I might take that bet with Austin, just if he gives me really good odds. Because here I think this comes down a lot to Iran. And the Obama administration has gotten a lot of criticism for talking to Iran about Iraq. And I would just say, I think people who are criticizing the Obama administration for that are being naive if they think that they can broker some kind of political agreement in Iraq without involving Iran. It's just not consistent with the realities as they are today. I'm not for coordinating militarily with Iran. I don't think much good can come of that, but I think politically there has to be coordination. And that, the pressure on Maliki, there's actually new pressure nodes on Maliki that didn't exist 2 weeks ago. And that is that Iran probably looks at the situation in Iraq and is pretty unhappy with it. They do not want Syria being right up against their border. And so there's at least a strong contingent in Iran, I would guess, who's thinking that continuing having Maliki as prime minister is not in the stability of Iraq, and so that they would consider leaning in. There's also the Marja'i, which is the religious establishment in Najaf, and they have played a very important political role, and all signs suggest that they're not that keen on having Maliki continue in power because of the destabilizing factor. So you might actually get a coalition of actors that could make, particularly the second scenario in which a different Shia political leader comes forward. But I think there's a lot that needs to be done. There's a lot on the Kurdish side. Americans actually have leverage with the Kurds. There's a lot on, giving Maliki some assurances that if he's not prime minister, he's not going to be hanging from a lamppost, which has basically been the fate of most people who are no longer Iraqi prime ministers. So, there's a lot that needs to be done, and that's sort of my argument for a very robust American diplomatic engagement. But we need leverage to do that, and in some of the rationale for military assistance is that it provides us with leverage. Going back to your question is, I see you shaking your head, but why didn't we get rid of this guy? Well, we didn't. One, Iraq does have a constitution. 2, we didn't really have leverage inside of Iraq. And 3, actually, the Obama administration relied on Maliki for a lot of things. I'll try to answer your question just in two sentences. Basically, this has to do with the erosion of the institutions under Maliki. So Maliki sent something to the Supreme Court after the election in 2010 and asked for the court to make a judgment about whether the Constitution says that the party with the largest number of seats gets the first chance to form the government, or the collection of parties that form a coalition after the election gets that right. Now, I remember when they were working on their Constitution, I was in government, and I said to them, this isn't clear. This is going to be a problem. And they said, oh, don't worry about it. And so Maliki said, oh, we'll bring this to the court and see what the court has to say. And the court is completely politicized by Maliki. Not surprisingly, the court came out with a decision saying, well, it's the post-election coalition that gets, the largest post-election coalition that gets to form a new government. And that, of course, was Maliki and other Shia parties that came together under him. Now, it's interesting because I understand that Maliki has changed his view on that and now thinks it should be the largest party that, but again, this goes to the point about the deterioration in Iraqi institutions that have occurred over the last so many years, and how those infringements have largely gone unchecked and get us to a situation where we are today.
Just to inject one even more depressing thought into this, which is on the difficulties of dislodging Maliki, even if within his coalition you could come up with an alternative name, and that is Maliki as Commander-in-Chief and Minister of Defense, who, even though he has presided over the loss of 3 of his country's borders and significant chunks of territory and the sources of water in the Tigris and Euphrates, has elite military units that are loyal to him personally. And even if you get a political change within the Shia coalition, it is not entirely clear that the loyalties of those units would simply transfer to whoever emerges from some U.S.-Iranian Shia backroom deal on who could replace them. And then you get into really more questions about further fragmentation of state institutions, which is an even deeper problem, is probably one that accelerates things like the autonomy movement in Basra and so forth. And if you look at things that have happened in Syria, you can really see sometimes you can very tenaciously hold on to power if you're willing to see immense bloodshed, loss of territory, the fleeing of a fifth of your population, and the falling apart of state institutions. And
real quick on that, anybody that even wanted to take the job from Maliki might end up on the Tariq al-Hashimi path, right? Suddenly we discover you're a terrorist and you have a warrant out for your arrest that these elite forces would serve. So that's why, even though I think you're right, an Iranian-U.S. agreement might be able to, on paper, leverage him out. I don't know that anybody would actually try to take the job, given what could happen.
There were two questions over here. Let's get both of them at the same time, and then give people a chance to respond. Or actually, there were three. Maybe if everyone, because I don't want to make sure we don't run out of time. So let's ask those three questions, and then people can respond to all of them, or as many as they want.
Sure. Michael Kramer here. Quick question. From press reports, at least, it seems that ISIS has made some money in Syria by taking control of oil fields there and getting revenue from that. Do you see in Iraq at all it having a strategy of making invasions or incursions into areas specifically to gain access to oil fields or other oil-producing areas in order to get a source of revenue there?
If you could pass that behind you, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, Jim Dingman from Pacifica Radio. You raised several issues about the logistics and intelligence picture of the military, but 4 divisions collapsing, not like the Central Highlands in Vietnam in 1975, I might add, which fought very hard, but basically dissolving is quite an extraordinary phenomena. And I was wondering if you could illuminate that, because we had reports that officers fled their units beforehand. We had reports that the amount of ISIS people involved were very small, 800 to 1,000 compared to 30,000 troops. What does that bode well for the rest of the Army? Meghan mentioned 70 battalions, combat ineffective. That is quite extraordinary. And I wonder if you could further illuminate that, because that implies the whole thing could collapse rather rapidly.
Yeah, and then
I wanted to add more a quick question about something that you mentioned about anyone can answer it actually, but the sort of the failure of the petro state, and I think that's kind of a fascinating concept in and of itself. And I wondered, I guess my question is, what is the alternative if in fact we're witnessing places like Iraq rather, Libya, Venezuela, and all of these other hot spots of instability sort of collapsing? What does that mean for the oil market, and what kind of rises in its place?
So who wants to take any one of those three?
I mean, I'll take the first one really quickly, and absolutely. I mean, the fighting Meghan mentioned about the Beijing oil refinery, that's not just to take it away from the central government, but that was a huge source of money for Al-Qaeda in Iraq when it was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, 2006, 2007 timeframe. They're really good at making money from a lot of sources. One that I looked at quite closely when I was there in 2007 and 2008 was used car sales. They would carjack people, sell their cars across borders. They would actually rent cars in Syria and Jordan, drive them to Iraq and sell them. I mean, these guys are really good at finding sources of revenue. And I think, Beijing was a cash cow for them before. I'm sure they're thinking sort of similarly now.
The failure of the petrostate idea that Ed raised, I'm wondering if other people on the panel sort of want to respond to it, have agreed, disagree? What does that mean for the future of the energy markets or geopolitics more broadly?
I mean, I'll take a little bit of that in terms of, one of the countries that Ed sort of brought up quickly was Nigeria. And I think that when you have the scenario that sort of Ed talks about in terms of how much production is off the market because of sort of pronounced political and security problems in a number of these states, then you start thinking about, what other places could you see supply disruption and sort of make this more of a terrible toxic mix? And you get to countries like Nigeria, and you would say, is there something about the resource curse argument when you have countries like Nigeria, other African producers, that you're sort of begging, please do not go offline at this moment. And one of the things that we are really concerned about when we look at a country like that is, it was a country that, in 2001 we thought could do 4 million barrels a day of production by 2010, and they're lucky if they make 1.7 million because of so much criminality, so much corruption involving the energy sector. You have a situation where rents are extracted by a small elite, not dispersed amongst the population. And so I think that, one of the problems for the market going forward is that you don't have, particularly good governance in a lot of these producing countries, and that becomes a little bit of a death style for your production profile, because then you get into situations where you can't actually grow production.
It's really a complicated subject that we're not going to do justice to in little, headline comments, but we can look at all the factors that go into the fragmentation of these petroleum producing countries that are basically around the grab. It's basically around revenue distribution in countries where there are exploding populations and octogenarian leaders who have been corrupt and are not seen as legitimate. On the other hand, since money is at stake, and it's a question of scale, one can imagine that there are solutions in Libya that have to do with money, that have to do with how oil revenues get distributed regionally within various groups. It may be political fragmentation is a precursor to it, but you can't have chaos forever, I don't think. And money is a solution to some of the problems.
Maybe I take the negative side of having worked on some of the African producers for a long time, because again, we just kept saying at a certain point a country like Nigeria will have to sort of turn around, because at some point you'll have to get the sector to be reformed, you'll have to get the criminality out of it, you'll have to use the money more appropriately, and yet we haven't seen them turn the corner. Now, they've sort of plateaued, things had gotten worse at one point, but we have yet to get into that virtuous cycle, and we keep waiting for that to happen on the oil side. And again, I just remember from 2001, we kept talking about this being a sort of country as a next big, wave of production that just didn't materialize.
So I've added to our list of fall events, once the semester starts, the failure of the petrostate. We'll invite all of you back. But let's use our last couple of minutes to turn back to Iraq and just see if there were, I know there was a question in the front, if there were other questions. Yeah, right here and then over there.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, very quickly, I have a question to Meghan and Daniel. So Meghan, you briefly touched upon how in the second phase of things, we might see an all-out sectarian conflict in Iraq. And I was just wondering if you consider it to be a tail risk for this kind of sectarian conflict to spread to the other Gulf state in the region. If you could just briefly comment on that. Thank you.
One or two more questions and then kind of open it up.
Okay, hi, I'm Peter Kellerman from Columbia University. In this rapidly expanding conversation, I'm just curious to hear your views on how the supply disruptions and potential future supply disruptions might affect negotiating positions for Russia with regards to, for example, Ukraine or Iran.
Was there one other question? Yeah.
Hi, Sarah Stender. My question is in regards to with the Kurds taking over more control, and possibly more oil fields and oil revenue, how will that impact the stability of the Iraqi government?
All right, so let's start first with the sectarian conflict spreading, which Meghan or anyone else who wants to come in on that.
Sure. Can I just make a quick comment about the petrostate idea? Kind of consistent with Heilma's points, often when we've been looking at the Arab revolutions, commentators have said, well, eventually whoever takes over, they're going to have to produce the oil. So, don't be too worried about it because they're going to need the revenues. But if we really look, particularly in the Arab world, but not exclusively, at the ability of governments that have come in after revolutions to maintain production, it happens almost nowhere. The Libyan production after Gaddafi came into power never got close to pre-1969 production. Iranian production never got close to the 6 million barrels a day before the Iranian Revolution. Look at Iraq. You could even say, Venezuela, definitely, Russia. I mean, there's very little support for the fact that just because people need the revenue, it will materialize. The second point, just about the end of the petrostate, which I'll save for the next panel if you invite me back. But I think this actually geopolitically really puts more power in the hands of the United States compared to a lot of these other states. So in an odd way, it means that maybe the U.S. has to be more active in the world, but I think it gives the U.S. More power and prestige. On the spreading violence, I think it's a very real possibility that the sectarian violence will destabilize the region more broadly. Even if you just think about the humanitarian dimensions of the crisis, and you've seen just in the last week hundreds of thousands of internally displaced people in Iraq, and you think about Jordan's ability, Turkey's ability, Kurdistan's ability to actually shelter hundreds of thousands of more refugees. I mean, this could be massively destabilizing for Jordan, which of course will, it's been pretty amazing that Israel has really been able to isolate itself from the real negative winds in the region. But this may be, a bridge too far because of the pressure that it's going to put on Israel's immediate neighbors. So I think that's part of the calculation of U.S. interests. And I know I made this argument to some of my colleagues at Harvard about why Syria was a problem, because it was going to destabilize Iraq. And they were like, you're just doing the domino theory. And I'm like, okay, maybe, but maybe it's true. So yeah, I think it's a very real possibility, and one that it could have implications for Saudi Arabia going to the whole oil market, Kuwait, others as well.
Daniel, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, I think what we are seeing is a very long historical process, which is we're seeing the collapse of the system of borders that have existed since the end of World War I. And if you think about what were the historical processes in Europe, for example, following the end of the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg empires and the interregnum, and then ultimately the bloodletting that was World War II, and the way it allowed the cleaning out of unwanteds in various places, ultimately giving way to a stable system of state borders. And we are seeing that at least in Iraq and Syria, you can, sort of make out the confines, and again, clearing into more coherent ethno-sectarian state units in that area. Obviously, the Kurds were the big losers after World War I. We can see the contours of a Kurdistan. We could maybe see a Shiastan that is Baghdad south. You can see Alawistan with little pockets of minorities within Syria, and then we're left with our Sunnistan that is somewhere between parts of Syria and into Iraq. And this is sort of happening, and this is something that will be protracted and quite violent. I think you have seen a lot of the ethnic cleansing already done in Iraq. Is one of the upsides from having had the conflict we went through in 06, 07, as far as the degree of bloodletting that could come out in this further area, though it's not been complete. And this is all obviously very depressing thoughts, but it also seems to be a reality. For the Saudis, for example, looking on this with some alarm, who do view this within the kind of existential views of the sectarian Sunni-Shia split and the very real geostrategic rivalry with Iran, which is not just about the nuclear issue, which is more of an Israeli issue than it is for the Saudis. When you were talking Sunni, Shia, and Arab, Persian, and all of it, I think an intensification of involvement and proxy support, especially given the questions around U.S. orientation, attention span, involvement. I mean, already we're seeing Saudi Arabia essentially buying Egypt and attempting to buy who it can within Syria. I suspect we will see this happening intensely within Iraq as well.
About what it means for the Kurds. I just want to see either of you or anyone else, if you want to come in on that and maybe add to that sort of what is the U.S. interest here? Is it in the U.S. national interest to ensure that continue to have a unified Iraq, or is this actually an opportunity in some sense?
I suspect it's the changing of borders is something that is too difficult for the international system to actually deal with. And when I think about what an Iraq could look like, I mean, I was watching the Bosnian team at the World Cup, and it reminds me again, we look in the map and we see this thing called Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we know its shape on the world map, and we think it's one thing, which it's not. It's actually two very separate entities within one border, and that to me is more how to think about what an Iraq could be. If there's a good way out of it, would be towards confederation within its existing borders, but I think it'd be extraordinarily difficult to pull off the diplomacy that would be required for some kind of grand regional settlement to redraw these borders. Getting the Iranians and the Saudis and the Americans and the Turks and everybody in one room and to agree on how to do this is near impossible. But for the Kurds, I mean, if you for all intents and purposes, they already have very wide-ranging autonomy over in some fiscal matters, in security matters, in terms of self-government. What they don't have is the full legal right to market the crude that they have been developing, and that's to come. But I think if before this they were in a increasingly strong position to try to bargain the realities of the production and the export infrastructure they put in place into some sort of a bargain with Baghdad, a budgetary deal that would enable exports, joint marketing, some mechanism for revenue transfer. So some kind of a deal to enhance their autonomy. Now that they hold Kirkuk, and now that they hold the feedstock for the Beji refinery, wherever that thing settles, they just have a much greater hand. And I would think the questions to be asked in Erbil is, what are you bargaining for here? Are you bargaining for greater autonomy, or are you bargaining now for independence? I think it would be the time to quietly sounding out in Ankara, in Washington, what are the conditions where the world will be ripe towards a more stronger move towards an independence declaration.
So I promised to add to our list of fall events something on Russia and the Ukraine too, unless anyone in the remaining 30 seconds wants to come in on that. But we'll come back to it otherwise, I promise. But this was a really timely and fascinating discussion. I learned a great deal, and I really appreciate all of you taking the time to be here. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a really fascinating discussion.